Mr. Patti, you were chief of mission, is that right, for the OSS?
Yes, I was the chief of the OSS mission in Kunming and then later in Hanoi.
What years, what time were you there?
1944, 45.
What were your responsibilities at that time?
At the time was actually the gathering of intelligence for the United States, clandestine intelligence in Indochina.
With whom did you deal?
Well, I dealt mainly with the French, of course, originally, until they refused to collaborate with the Americans. Then I had to find someone else, and I found the Vietnamese, and among the Vietnamese I found was the Viet Minh, which was headed by Ho Chi Minh.
What kind of relations did you have with Ho Chi Minh?
Had very good professional relations in the sense that we wanted intelligence, and he was in a position to give it to us in terms of having the people in the field and having the knowledge of the area and the issues, and therefore he was very helpful that way, and we used them well. Got us order of battle, he got us political intelligence, he got us intelligence of what the French were trying to do at the time to try to conquer their lost colony, and so on.
What was his view of the Western world, as you recall it?
Yes, indeed I do. I mean, as far as, speaking of Ho Chi Minh, yes, well, Ho Chi Minh was very pro-Western rather than Moscow-oriented. Now, let me explain that. A lot of people have been questioning that point. The thing is that I asked Ho, and I went into detail on that in my book, and in the very last chapter, I quote him up and down the line. I asked Ho what he thought the role of the new Vietnam that he had just established would be in the Western world, or in the world at large. And he said to me that he would look to the West to help him build his country. Not necessarily financially, but financially, yes, but also with technical advice. And he was looking to anyone in the Western world, not particularly the Americans. He was happy to have the French come back, not as conquerors or as colonial power, but come back as a strictly as advisors.
Well, he seemed to be a reasonable sort of man at that time, from what you say. Did his attitude change, do you think, over the years? Did he harden towards the West?
Yes, his attitude did change, and I'd say it changed about the late 50s, especially when he found out that really the Americans were trying to build a counterpart to the legitimate Vietnam, which was the North Vietnam. And they were very unhappy about that, of course. He really turned around 180 degrees, and he just said, well, all right, now the enemy is identified, and that's it.
Well, with your background, your experience, your knowledge about that part of the world, I'm wondering if during the Vietnamese War, if you did not have thoughts that we were going about it incorrectly, that we were not attempting to communicate with the other side or understand the other side.
You're correct, you're right. I didn't have that feeling, not that feeling, but I knew that we were going about it the wrong way, and I so advised our people in Washington, our State Department, and the White House. I also, in late 45, I proposed that we go ahead and recognize Ho Chi Minh after he had sent us several letters. In fact, he sent us about 12 missiles, to my knowledge, and in forms of memoranda and letters and cablegrams to the President of the United States, to the Secretary of State, and to the chairman of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs.
What was there in Washington, in your view? Was there a mindset against just simply talking with the other side?
No, it's not really quite that cut and dried. It's not that monolith as your words might imply. What happened after the war in 1946 was Vietnam didn't exist. It was placed not even on a back burner. It just was a non-entity. It was a French problem and of no concern to the United States. So actually, we weren't doing a thing. I was shuffling papers from right to left of my desk, cables coming in from Vietnam, from Hanoi, from Saigon, and from Ceylon, and Chungking, and I would try to pass those on to the White House and the State Department, and I never knew what happened to them. Never heard another word, never got a comeback on any of them.
In other words, we were vastly ignorant about Vietnam, and we were without interest in the country.
Not only without interest, but vastly ignorant, as you put it. You did it very well. We didn't even know, well, we had no idea of what was in Vietnam, what the problem was. It was a French problem. It was a colony. It was a good colony. You could live well there, cheaply, and that's about all we knew. We didn't care that the new nation was being born.
Well, at the time we became or began to become involved in Vietnam militarily, when we sent the advisors out, was our lack of information just as great as...
Greater.
Greater, really.
Greater. And the reason why it was greater is because the need now was greater. The need for more information, more knowledge of the political structure, more knowledge of the economic potential, more knowledge of the ethnic problems. We didn't have that.
Well, you've already told us about the willingness of Ho Chi Minh to communicate with us in those early days. How could we have avoided this war? I think you've hinted at it already, but let's elaborate on that a little bit.
We keep talking about the war, and I find it very difficult at this particular conference to reconcile the fact that we are reconsidering, and I say reconsidering, the Vietnam problem or the Vietnam issue. In reconsidering it, I find that we are not striking at the heart of the matter, which is not a war. It's not a question of a war. True that we lost 57,000 men, 300,000 wounded, et cetera, on our side, plus 2 million on the other side. It was not a true war, because in order to have a war, you must have an enemy, and we had no enemy. We had no enemy in Indochina, in Vietnam.
This comes as a statement that'll surprise a good many people.
I'm sure. I'll be glad to try to elaborate on that if I can. There was no enemy in 1945 or in 46 when actually the French were thrown out, or let's put it this way, when Ho Chi Minh took to the jungle and started to fight a war, the first Indochina War against the French. It was not an American war, and they were not our enemy. In 1954, after Dien Bien Phu, when the French finally capitulated and the Viet Minh took over lock, stock, and barrel, they were not fighting the Americans. Therefore, we had no enemy at that point, 1954. We created a client state, and I mean we, I say the Americans created a client state in the South. We, in turn, invented two opposing forces, the South and the North. It was an American invention, pure and simple. It wasn't the people of South Vietnam that wanted to fight the people of North Vietnam, and the people of North Vietnam felt that they didn't have to fight because it was theirs to start with. Now then, where is this enemy? Not until we started to send our first so-called advisors to Vietnam did we create enemies. And I just returned from Hanoi, and I spoke to the man on the street, spoke to the intelligentsia, I spoke to the politicians, the hardliners, I spoke to a lot of people. And one question that came out loud and clear was, why do you hate us? Speaking to me as an American, why do you hate us? And when I said, no, I don't believe we hate you, he says, oh, yes, you do. You won't let us have any powdered milk. We can't have any needles, hypodermic needles. We can't have any rubber gloves, surgical gloves, and we can't have this and we can't have that because you're embargoing. Of course you hate us. So remember that we didn't come to the United States and we didn't fight you people on your land or in your home, nor did we come over to defoliate your forest. So really, I mean, why do you hate us? They take the position that they did nothing to us. We did it all to them. And when we look around, we see that a lot has been done to them now. Just who did it, I am pretty sure that we did a lot of it. In fact, I don't know anyone else except the French.
I would think that you're better qualified than most of us to judge the quality of reporting that came out of the Vietnam War. What did you think of it?
Well, you're very kind to say that I'm best qualified, but I only look at it strictly from the viewpoint of the recipient of news that came through during the war. Now, we're speaking of the war, the American war, is that correct?
Right.
All right. The type of news we received in our dining room or living room all through the war, and I saw a lot of it, was the kind of news that was partial blood and guts, and was a sort of a emotional, titillating type. Now, was it informative? Did it tell us anything? I don't believe that it told us much. Sure, we saw bodies, maimed bodies all over the place, blood and guts, but that was not news. For example, we never knew what was happening, what were the results of our actions towards the so-called, and I say so-called, enemy, the Vietnamese. We never did know how much damage we did there. For example, my last trip to Hanoi, I found that what people pointed to me as craters that were made by American bombers. Well, now, I heard Harrison Salisbury report on the bombing of the hospital and things of that sort, but not to the extent of the damage that we inflicted upon the Vietnamese. We never got that information. For example, another type of information we never received, the American people were never informed as to the nature of the Vietnamese politics, except in terms of propaganda. All we heard here was that Ho Chi Minh had murdered, slaughtered thousands of people in his land reform, that he had eliminated this and that and the other man. Well, now, that we know is straight propaganda. But that is all the information we were getting. So, but we did have access. We could have gotten the information if we wanted. How?
That was my next question. It's been said that we learned about only one half of the war. In fact, you've said that the other half was not reported. We didn't have any correspondence on the other side, with the exception of Harrison Salisbury went up there one time, as I recall. Could we have gotten in there?
We got in there. And I'll tell you how we got in there. We had a large number of foreign correspondents in Hanoi and on the other side of the 17th parallel. We had Japanese, we had Indians, we had Chinese. Of course, at that time we weren't talking to the Chinese. Nevertheless, we did have Australians, Canadians.
So the Western world was represented.
Exactly, the Western world was well represented, but it wasn't presenting the story to the American public. And if it was, it never got on the air or in the print.
Well, was that lack of interest on our part, or was this following a government line? Why?
I'm inclined, and of course this is a bit of shot in the dark, I believe was all part of the government policy or directive as to what kind of news should come out. Not that we had censorship, not in a true
I
form.
mean, a little body English?
A little body English, if you like to put it that way, yes. In other words, if a correspondent was known to be continuously reporting Hanoi news, he might eventually lose his press card. Not exactly, but what would happen was he wouldn't get the first crack before the embargo on a particular piece of news that was important, domestic news. We've known that this has happened over and over again. I mean, there's nothing unusual.
Well, couldn't that material from the Australians, the Japanese, the French, the others who were operating in Hanoi, couldn't that have been passed directly to Washington by way of London or Tokyo?
It could have. It could have been passed directly. Well, actually, we were getting that information in the government.
Yeah.
But as far as the media was concerned, it wasn't that it didn't have access, because really it did have access through its home office. They could have gotten all that information. But the pressure was from, let's say, the White House and the State Department and the Pentagon. Look, here's a good hot piece of news. It's American slanted. In other words, this is one of the techniques that would be used.
It would appear that the Australians, the Japanese, and the others had little or no difficulty getting into North Vietnam. But the Americans, would it have been possible for more than one? We know Salisbury got in. Could anyone else have gotten in?
Let us remember that Salisbury was only in there for a very short time. That was a one-time shot.
Yeah.
Okay. On a permanent basis, in order to be able to have a corps of correspondents, you must have some kind of recognition, and we didn't have that. All right, let's put that aside.
Diplomatic recognition.
Yes. Let's put that aside, and let us say that Ho was willing, or not Ho, but the government, the Vietnamese government, was willing to let the Americans come in there and report the news. If we would have guaranteed, I'm sure this is the position I would have taken in Ho's place, if we would have guaranteed a honest reportage, all well and good, but he had no way of knowing whether we were going to report the right news or only the bad news of the North. So the question, I'm not trying to beg the question here. What I'm trying to say is that logically, it doesn't stand to reason that I would bring in the enemy into my home to see how I run my kitchen.
Well, there were no American correspondents on the Japanese side in World War II, were there?
Exactly. Nor did we have any in Germany.